Hi everyone, I'm Sasha. I'm here every Wednesday bringing you true crime stories. Today, I'll be talking about a woman who came to be known as Satan in a skirt and the she-wolf of the Urals. Wondering who she is? Well, let me tell you the whole story. Irina Gaidamachuk was born on September 26, 1972 in Karpinsk, Russia. Shortly after her birth, her family moved to a nearby city called Nyagan. Growing up, Irina seemed like a normal child. She didn't really stand out at school or do anything that caught people's attention. After finishing school, she got into university where she studied either law or psychology. Sources differ on that. So, not long after, she got pregnant, married, and dropped out after the birth of her daughter, Alina. But Irina didn't become the ideal mom. Sadly, she became more and more drawn to alcohol, going on drinking sprees, and showing little interest in her daughter. She basically turned into an alcoholic, neglecting her daughter, Alina. Her husband tried to cope at first, but eventually he decided to kick Irina out of the house, along with their daughter. Like, dude, come on. Why kick your own kid too? Keep the daughter and get rid of your alcoholic wife. It's just so sad. Anyway, sadly, Irina ended up sending Alina to an orphanage. Mind you, the daughter was 6 years old at this point. She was understanding what was happening, and that is so heartbreaking. Poor little girl. Irina continued to drink heavily. It's unclear where she was living during this time or what her family situation was. There is hardly any mention of her parents, so it seems like she had no contact with them. Anyway, in the late 90s, Irina met a young man from Krasnoufimsk. It's a city in Russia, and I'll be mentioning that city quite often, so keep that in mind. He was working as a bank driver, or CAT, cash and transfer driver, responsible for transporting money and valuable assets between banks, ATMs, businesses, and other locations. He happened to be in Nyagan, where Irina lived. He was on a business trip. They started an affair, and things escalated quickly. Even though she was technically still married to her first husband, that didn't stop her from getting pregnant again and moving to Krasnoufimsk with her new lover. My God, this woman. Soon after, the couple welcomed their daughter, Nastya. This time, according to friends, acquaintances, and neighbors, Irina seemed like the ideal mom. She took care of her daughter, walked her to school every day, and she was even a member of the parent committee for Nastya's class. Look at you, Irina, doing so great. It seemed like Irina had turned a new leaf. But of course, that didn't last. By the time Nastya was ready to graduate, Irina started drinking again. As the parent committee head, she was responsible for collecting money from other parents for the graduation party. But what did Irina do with that money? She drank it all away. Of course. This, of course, turned into a huge scandal. Her common law husband tried everything he could to fight Irina's alcoholism. He stopped giving her any money, hoping it would keep her from buying alcohol. But let's be real. Alcoholics always find a way. She started coming up with different excuses to borrow money from neighbors. But before long, everyone realized what she needed the money for, and they stopped sponsoring her. Good for them, right? But Irina still needed the money, desperately. In the early 2000s, she started working part-time, whitewashing ceilings and knitting clothes to sell. Doesn't sound too bad. She earned money, paid off her debts, and, of course, started buying alcohol again. But this time, she was using her own money. Isn't that wonderful? In 2002, and here's where things start to take a dark turn. This is where Irina's actions become evil, brutal, and honestly unexplainable. One day, Irina was whitewashing the ceilings in an elderly woman's apartment. At first, it seemed like just another job, but at some point, she noticed some valuable looking items around the house and started wondering if the lady had any money hidden, maybe tucked under a mattress or inside a pillow, as many elderly people living alone might do. As the woman was busy in the kitchen, Irina began searching through her belongings, hoping to steal something valuable. But while she was rummaging through the items, the woman walked back into the room and saw Irina digging through her things. She started shouting, raising her voice, trying to make Irina stop. But Irina had only one spontaneous thought in her mind. She grabbed a hammer laying nearby and struck the poor woman on the head, hitting her several times. Tragically, the blows were fatal, and the lady died right there in her own home. Oh, so sad. Home is supposed to be your safe place. You're supposed to feel the most safe at your own house with the doors closed. Afterward, Irina took whatever she could find of value, and with the stolen money, she went out and bought herself vodka. Oh, ta-da! Yeah, surprising. What else could have she bought with the money she stole? What does an alcoholic buy? Vodka. Oh, what's wrong with you, Irina? Seriously. Since no one knew Irina had been whitewashing the woman's ceilings, the police had no leads and couldn't detain her in hot pursuit. Now that's when Irina began to think that killing elderly women for something valuable could be a solid plan. She'd leave home under the pretense of going to work, but instead she'd wander around neighborhoods looking for elderly women who might be easy targets, not drawing too much attention to herself. She'd quietly follow them to their apartments. Once there, she'd pretend to be someone they could trust, a fire inspector, a housing and communal services employee, or even a social worker. Using these identities, she'd gain their trust, and most of the time, sadly, they'd let her right in. To make her story more believable, she sometimes even left a note on a victim's door, saying something like, "Oh, House and Communal Services, please be home at 1 p.m. on 12th of May for a checkup." I mean, back then, things weren't as developed as they are now. And it was so much easier to convince someone, especially elderly people, that you are an official worker. Poor them. Irina wasn't just clever with her manipulation tactics. She also had this strange charisma that made people actually favor her and even like her. It's as if she had the ability to win people over, making her schemes that much easier to pull off. Her second victim was cautious and wary of strangers. She didn't trust easily and never let anyone into her home unless she knew them very well. But on one fateful day, Irina managed to talk her way in, convincing the elderly woman to open the door, and unfortunately, the woman let Irina inside. The woman, being polite, offered Irina some tea. Irina, of course, responded warmly, saying, "Yes, yes, please, I'd love some tea." But as soon as the woman turned her back and headed to the kitchen, Irina quietly pulled out her hammer and, without hesitation, bludgeoned her to death. That's evil. Just absolutely evil. After bludgeoning her victim, Irina would cover the woman's head with a pillow before starting her search for valuables. This became her routine. She always made sure her targets lived alone, and once she'd killed them, she'd cover their heads and then get down to the business of stealing. Maybe she felt a sliver of guilt and couldn't stand to look at their faces. Or perhaps it was just her way of blocking out the distraction while she ransacked the place. Who knows? When questioned after her capture, Irina explained that one of her reasons for killing elderly women was simply because, quote, they were old. They'd already lived their lives and had nothing left to live for. What? That's a whole new level of twisted logic. Man, Irina. To add to this, her other reasons were murky at best. Some sources say she just hated elderly people, while others suggested she harbored a deep seated rage toward her mother in law, who was always in conflict with her. Regardless, all her reasons were selfish, unbelievably twisted, and I mean, downright insane. People called her the devil's sister in law. But honestly, I'd just call her the devil herself. Irina would take anything she could get her hands on: food, jewelry, small valuables, and cash. But here's the truly sick part. Most of the time, the amount of money she stole was equivalent to about $30. That's nothing. Absolutely nothing. And yet, she thought it was worth taking someone's life for that. The biggest house she ever managed to steal was around $350. That was it. The absolute most she ever got from her victims. A few times she even left with absolutely nothing. Either the elderly women had hidden their valuables too well, or they simply had nothing worth taking. It makes her actions seem even more pointless, knowing she was willing to kill for so little, or in some cases for nothing at all. Man, that's psycho. In a few cases, Irina even tried to set fire to her victims' apartments after killing them. She'd leave an iron on, light a candle, or even leave the stove running, hoping to destroy evidence. But her attempts never worked. Sooner or later, her victims were always discovered. On one occasion, during a cold winter day in 2008, Irina killed an 80-year-old woman. Afterward, she followed her usual routine, placing a pillow over the woman's head. But what she did next is truly disturbing. She stayed in the woman's kitchen all night, casually sitting there and writing out the lyrics to Beatles songs. What? Yeah, writing lyrics to Beatles songs. Who does that? I can't. It's not funny. It's so painful if you think about it. I mean, I never heard of such a routine before. I never heard anyone do this before, but oh well, that's Irina. That's her twisted psycho mind. Irina's only failed attempt came with her third victim in February 2003. Posing as a social worker, she began attacking an elderly woman right at the doorway. She managed to land a few blows, but the woman miraculously survived and even remembered what her attacker looked like. She described her as a blonde woman in a fake fur coat. From this description, the police created an identikit, and soon flyers were all over the city, urging the public to unite and help catch this horrifying perpetrator. Back then, the police were stunned. They weren't convinced a woman could be behind such brutal killings. Typically, women who become killers tend to choose sort of cleaner methods, like poisoning or shooting, rather than something as violent as bludgeoning. The brutality of these attacks fit more of a male serial killer profile. So detectives even considered the possibility that it was a man dressed as a woman. Nonetheless, the search for the blonde woman intensified. Police interviewed hundreds of blonde women, hoping to find the right suspect, but tracking her down was challenging. As fear had spread throughout Krasnoyarsk, and many blonde women in the area had started dyeing their hair brown or black to avoid suspicion. So, at this point, since many women were dyeing their hair brown or black, detectives decided to start fingerprinting local women and then track their addresses through the passport office database, hoping to find at least one lead. This procedure made sense as fingerprints had been found at some of the crime scenes. Unfortunately, it led nowhere. As it turned out, years later, when Irina was finally caught, she'd left her passport behind in Nyagan as a collateral for a loan. So when she moved to Krasnoyarsk, pregnant with her second child, and living with her common law husband, she essentially disappeared from the system. Tricky one, very tricky. The identikit was even hanging on the door of a store directly across from Irina's building, and yet no one noticed. No one noticed. Or perhaps no one wanted to believe it could possibly be her. I mean, can you imagine living so close to someone capable of such evil? It's chilling. But sadly, this oversight allowed Irina to continue her brutal spree for another 7 years. She became increasingly cunning, using wigs and disguises to avoid detection. She even started traveling to nearby cities where her face wasn't as well known to commit her crimes. In one particularly horrifying instance, she killed 4 elderly women in just 2 days. 4 lives gone just like that. One day, though she came dangerously close to being caught, she had entered an old woman's house, ready to carry out another attack, But this time, the victim suspected something was wrong. Maybe it was Irina's demeanor. Maybe it was just instinct. We don't know. But she managed to call the police before her tragic death. The responding officer arrived quickly, ringing the doorbell repeatedly, but no one answered. Meanwhile, Irina was inside, completely still, hiding and waiting for the officer to leave. And as it often happens in these frustrating stories, the officer eventually gave up and left. I mean, couldn't he have called for backup or broken down the door? Like, come on, you guys. The poor woman's life could have been saved, and Irina might have been stopped right there. But no. After waiting for the coast to clear, Irina slipped out of the apartment and disappeared once again, leaving no trace behind. By this time, the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Elderly women were being brutally murdered, one after another. The community was on edge, but no one had concrete answers. Who was doing this and why? At the scene of her ninth crime, Irina made a crucial mistake. She left her hammer behind. That must be something. This was a turning point. The police discovered female fingerprints on the weapon, along with blood belonging to multiple victims. Suddenly, the pieces came together, and the authorities realized they were dealing with a serial killer. In February 2008, Irina knocked on yet another door, this time introducing herself as an employee of state gas. Unsuspecting, the elderly woman invited her in, just as so many others had before, right? Once inside, Irina carried out her usual horrific routine. She beat the woman to death with a hammer, tore off her gold necklace, and rummaged through the closet, taking every bit of money and jewelry she could find. Then she left, disappearing into the shadows once again. But this time, Irina's victim wasn't just anyone. The woman she killed was the mother of the deputy head of the local police department. And this tragedy changed everything. Now, solving the crime became an absolute priority. All efforts were focused on bringing the perpetrator to justice, and the pressure on investigators skyrocketed. Irina had no idea just how close the net was beginning to close around her. At the end of March 2008, police thought they had their breakthrough. Officers spotted a woman who matched the identikit perfectly and arrested her. Her name was Maria Valeyeva. Almost immediately, Maria began to confess, describing in detail all the brutal crimes she had supposedly committed. She even explained her motive. When she was just 14 years old, she was assaulted by multiple men, and according to her, it all happened in the apartment of an elderly woman who stood by and did nothing to help. Maria claimed her rage and desire for revenge led her to target elderly women as a way of getting back at the world. Did we get our person? Is that the perpetrator we've been looking for? It seemed like the case was finally closed. Maria confessed, and on the surface, everything lined up. But wait, why am I talking about a woman named Maria when the whole time I've been telling you about Irina? Here is where things take a darker turn. You see, while the police were eager to close the case, they still needed hard evidence to back up Maria's confession. As detectives were painstakingly trying to connect her to the crimes, something shocking happened. In a small town nearby, another brutal murder took place. An elderly woman was killed in the exact same manner as the previous victims. Ooh, but how could that be? Maria was in custody, locked away. Did this mean Maria wasn't the real killer after all? It turns out the answer was even worse. Maria's confession wasn't real. Under investigation, it was revealed that the officers who arrested her had tortured her into confessing to crimes she had absolutely no connection to. Can you believe that? Just to close the case, they forced an innocent woman to admit to heinous acts she never committed. Meanwhile, the real killer, Irina, was still out there continuing her horrifying spree. Maria was immediately released, and the officers who had tortured her faced serious consequences. Meanwhile, the real killer, Irina, was back in her so-called home city of Krasnoufimsk, living with her common-law husband and daughter, and as you might guess, she was from finished with her crimes. In Krasnoufimsk, Irina struck again, targeting a woman from whom she regularly bought milk, a woman who was basically her neighbor. Just days before, she had tried attacking another neighbor, but as Irina reached for her hammer, she was startled and scared off by the woman's son. Thank goodness for that. At least this time, her plan failed. We are now at the beginning of 2010. Irina made a strange announcement. Out of the blue, she told her common-law husband and daughter that she needed to visit her mother-in-law to return some borrowed items and money. But what do you know? Irina never came back. Her husband, understandably worried, began searching for her, but there were no signs of Irina anywhere. Eventually, he discovered that she had moved in with one of their neighbors and had no intention of returning home. Damn, Irina. So, not only was Irina a murderer, but she also abandoned her family without a second thought. Once again. What kind of person does that? This woman was something else entirely, I'm telling you. Cold and calculating and completely detached from any sense of responsibility or morality. Honestly, she's one of the most bizarre and chilling criminals I've ever heard of. Soon enough, Irina moved again. This time to live with yet another new lover. Honestly, this woman just bounced her way through man. I'm surprised she didn't end up pregnant for a third time and abandon yet another family. Ugh, it's baffling, really. In May of 2010, Irina set her sights on her next victim, an 81-year-old woman. Tragically, this woman would become the last known victim of the she-wolf of Krasnoufimsk. Irina attacked with a hammer, striking her poor victim 18 times. 18 times. The woman was likely gone after the first couple of blows, but Irina didn't stop. She just kept going. Now let me tell you, do you call that a crime of passion? Because I'd call it an overkill. Plain and simple. This wasn't just murder. It was something far darker. Pure evil, if you ask me. But even after 18 brutal blows, Irina convinced herself that the woman was still breathing. And what does this psycho do next? she starts strangling her. If that wasn't enough, she then filled the bathtub with water, dragged the poor woman into it, and drowned her. I mean, can you even wrap your head around this level of depravity? It's like she wouldn't stop until she was absolutely certain her victim was gone. Just horrifying. The body was discovered by firefighters who broke into the apartment. A concerned neighbor had called them after noticing something strange. The woman's cat had been meowing nonstop for days like crazy. The neighbor thought something's wrong. Her cat never acts like this, and honestly, poor cat. Animals can sense when something's off, don't you think? It's almost like she was crying for help. Poor little thing. Once again, the police were left baffled. They had nothing solid to work with, no witnesses, no clear leads. Desperate, they set up rewards for any tips from the public. They even consulted psychics. Nothing. It seemed like this case, like so many others, was heading nowhere. But then, finally, a break. One of the acquaintances of the last victim came forward with a memory. She recalled that a few years ago, the victim had hired a woman to whitewash her ceilings. Remember how Irina did that as a part-time job? Yes, yes, we are finally getting somewhere. Even better, the acquaintance remembered that just a few days before the murder, the elderly woman had called the same whitewashing lady again. And not only that, they had met at the railway depot where Irina worked part-time as a painter for ceilings and walls. This was it, finally. The police were closer than ever to catching the she-wolf. The police went to the depot, but they couldn't just arrest Irina on the spot. They needed to be sure, and they needed a warrant for arrest. So they invited her to the station just simply under the guise of questioning. Once there, they quickly ran her fingerprints, and what do you know? A match! Remember the female fingerprints found on the hammer Irina had left behind at one of her crime scenes? Yeah, it was her. But that wasn't all. The evidence against her kept piling up. What we didn't know until now is that one of Irina's victims had fought for her life. In the struggle, the victim managed to rip out a clump of Irina's hair. When the body was discovered, investigators found strands of hair in the victim's hand, which they later matched to Irina. This detail sealed her fate. As tragic as these cases are, it's remarkable when victims leave behind clues like scratches, hair, or anything that can lead to DNA evidence. It's heartbreaking, but sometimes these brave attempts to fight back play a crucial role in bringing monsters like Irina to justice. At the time of her conviction, Irina had 17 victims on her bloody hands. 17 elderly women aged between 60 and 90. And as I mentioned earlier, whatever she took from them, food, jewelry, small amounts of cash, was worth almost nothing. Nothing worth taking a life over. When Irina started confessing, she was taking to the crime scenes and openly explained how everything unfolded and her so-called motive. She claimed she started killing because her common law husband, I'm sorry, wouldn't give her money for vodka. I mean, really, Irina? You had a job. You could have just bought your own stupid vodka with the money you earned. What on earth was going in her head? Psychological examiners determined that, yes, she had some mental health issues, but nothing that made her unfit to stand trial. She was completely sane, and during the trial, Irina was arrogant, self centered, and showed absolutely no remorse. She genuinely believed her family, yes, the same family she abandoned, would provide an alibi for her. Can you imagine? Unsurprisingly, her family didn't back her up. In fact, they confirmed that she was rarely home and was drinking heavily most of the time. But here's the kicker, they didn't really say anything else negative about her. It's almost as if they were in disbelief themselves. In July 2012, Irina was convicted of 17 counts of first-degree murder, and her sentence, I'm sorry, I'm not smiling or laughing. It is just so painful and hysterical that I cannot, I'm having difficult times to even saying this out loud. Wait for it. 20 years in prison. 20 years. Are you kidding me? I mean, I don't claim to be an expert in Russian law, but come on. 20 years for 17 lives? That sounds absurdly light, don't you think? Honestly, it feels like a slap on the wrist compared to the devastation she caused. What do you think? Well, so that's that. She's still in prison to this day, and her daughter Nastya, unfortunately, didn't escape the horrors of her mother's crimes. She suffered severe mental breakdowns and ongoing psychological issues due to everything that came to light. And kids, they were cruel. She was bullied, ridiculed, and ostracized, just relentlessly made fun of. I can't even imagine how hard that must have been for her to go through this. There's not much information about her now, but I can only hope she's somehow managed to find a way to cope and move on, though it's probably been anything but easy. Irina's common law husband was also left in shock. I mean, can you even fathom discovering that the person you've loved and shared a life with is a serial killer? It's beyond comprehension. A truly sad and depressing aftermath for everyone involved. And that's the story of Irina Gaidamachuk, the she-wolf of the Urals, Satan in a skirt. It's a horrifying, absolutely twisted tale of senseless brutality. Killing just to steal money for vodka? That's something I've never heard of before. Personally, I think she had more going on. Maybe she enjoyed the power, playing God, deciding who lives and who dies, or perhaps it was some deep-seated hatred toward elderly women. Like, she was acting out some kind of twisted revenge. Honestly, who knows? But it's horrible, just absolutely horrible. What do you guys think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for being here with me today. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more chilling tales, and I'll see you next week. Bye bye.